Thank you for joining your desert frontiersman Alan for another collection of Southwest stories. This collection will be focused on famous Southwest outlaws. I hope you enjoy this as you relax or drive. Please leave a like or comment. Hit the subscribe button for more desert adventures. Welcome to another Southwest Desert episode, where we will recount the tragic events of the Bisbee Massacre, one of the bloodiest incidents in early Arizona history. Our story begins on a fateful evening in December 1883 in the mining town of Bisbee, Arizona. It was soon after dark on Saturday, December 8, 1883, when two men, one masked and one unmasked, entered the general store of A. Castaneda and Joe Goldwater in Bisbee. The unmasked man pointed his gun at the store's bookkeeper, Peter Dahl, demanding he raise his hands. Dahl hesitated at first, prompting the second masked bandit to also aim his revolver at the clerk. Three more masked men then entered the store, covering the customers and other employees. With multiple weapons trained on him, Goldwater quickly opened the safe. Meanwhile, two bandits had returned outside, patrolling the street with rifles. Just as Goldwater swung the safe door open, those inside heard one of the men outside shout, "Come on in here," at a passerby. The citizen replied, "No, you don't," before two gunshots rang out and the man staggered and fell dead against the Bon Ton saloon. The killing of the man, later identified as Johnny Tappenier, marked the beginning of the Bisbee Massacre, a ruthless incident that would claim 3 more lives before the night was through. This was no longer a common payroll holdup. It had become deadly serious. Realizing capture would mean the noose, the bandits now fired recklessly at anyone who showed themselves on the street. The second victim that night was D.T. Smith. Earlier, Smith had been in the store but left for a nearby restaurant. Upon hearing the gunfire, he rushed outside with his pistol, only to be shot in the head before he could act. The third innocent bystander killed was Mrs. W. Roberts, a 33-year-old woman recently arrived from New York. She unknowingly stepped into the street amid the chaos and was fatally shot. James A. Nally became the fourth victim while trying to find cover from the flying bullets. Hit in the chest, Nally made it to Bob Pierce's saloon before collapsing. He succumbed to his wounds the following day. Inside the store, as the slaughter unfolded outside, Joe Goldwater emptied the safe's contents into the thieves' bags under duress. Not satisfied with their take, one bandit went to the back room where the sickly Castaneda rested, forcing him to hand over a stash of gold hidden under his pillow. Their crime complete after 5 or 6 blood-soaked minutes, the 5 outlaws raced out of the store, occasionally firing over their shoulders to deter any pursuit as they mounted their waiting horses and galloped out of town. Deputy Sheriff Bill Daniels, who moonlighted running a saloon when not upholding the law, was shooting billiards when the first shots echoed outside. Rushing to investigate, he ran into a breathless man who filled him in on the situation. As Daniels moved to respond, he was pushed back inside by a half-dozen citizens scrambling for cover. Grabbing 2 guns and enlisting another armed man, the deputy raced out the rear entrance into a gulch behind the buildings. The pair made their way to the post office before emerging onto the chaotic street. By then, the bandits were fleeing on horseback. He unloaded his gun at the retreating outlaws, but the darkness made for inaccurate shooting. Returning to Castaneda and Goldwater's store, the deputy was apprised of the robbery by Joe. Daniels hurried to the Copper Queen mine office, where a man named Ben Williams offered horses and guns to provision a posse. Back in town, a boy informed Daniels he had spotted 5 men on horseback frantically riding towards Hereford. Finding the town in disarray but managing to gather a posse, Daniels headed to Tombstone to alert the sheriff while he and another man rode to Forest's Milk Ranch seeking a trail to follow. Daniels was told a party of 5 men had passed by not long before, a promising lead. Sending for the newly formed posse, they regrouped at the ranch, camping there until sunrise. The early light revealed tracks heading off the main road. As Daniels led the posse, a man named John Heath suddenly arrived, claiming to have found a divergent set of tracks splitting off further back. Though an experienced tracker who hadn't noticed another trail, Daniels nonetheless took Heath's advice to split up and follow both paths. Heath and 2 others rode towards Tombstone while Daniels continued westward. An hour later, with no further sign of their quarry, suspicion crept into the deputy's mind. Something was amiss, and John Heath warranted closer scrutiny. By now, Heath had a sizable head start, so Daniels could only double back to their original trail. The posse soon encountered another group near Sulphur Springs Valley who reported seeing a lone rider that morning, watching him alter course and ride off upon spotting them. The same account was offered by a man at Soldiers' Holes later that evening. With the outlaw estimated to be a half-day's ride ahead, Daniels pressed onward after pausing to rest and water the horses. Their next stop after nightfall was White's Ranch. The rancher shared that he had seen men matching the bandits' descriptions days prior at Buckles, a neighboring ranch. With no sightings of the lone rider that day, Daniels decided to halt for the night, the trail having gone cold. Rising with the sun, Daniels and his men set out for Buckles Ranch, arriving around 10 a.m. Frank Buckle had crucial information for the posse. 4 of the 5 robbers had been there the previous Wednesday, getting their horses shod. What's more, Buckle revealed that 2 of them had visited before. One was a debonair, mustachioed man with light hair and complexion, a perfect match for Tex Howard, the unmasked leader of the gang. The second, as described, was the spitting image of none other than John Heath. The pieces fell into place for Daniels. Heath and Howard were associates predating the crime. Heath's conveniently found set of tracks served to throw the posse off the scent. John Heath was now a wanted man. Sending a rider with a hobbled horse to Tombstone with orders to have Heath apprehended if spotted, Daniels also dispatched word to Ben Williams in Bisbee to be on the lookout. Based on Buckle's account, Daniels concluded that some or all of the murderous quintet had likely fled to Mexico. Leading the posse south, they searched in vain for 3 days, checking various ranches for any sign of the killer's passage. Empty-handed, the deputy headed back to Bisbee, realizing that even if on the right track, the fugitives would already be across the border. En route, news reached him that Heath had been arrested and jailed in Tombstone. Daniels resolved to hunt down the 4 remaining bandits. After a brief respite in Bisbee, Daniels rode out once more, fortune favoring him this time. He located Dan Dowd, one of the robbers, holed up in Corralitos, Chihuahua. Brazenly disregarding the international boundary, Daniels seized Dowd and smuggled him back to Arizona, locking him up in Tombstone. The rest of the gang fell in quick succession following Dowd's capture. Bill Delaney, the second masked marauder, was apprehended in Ninas Prietas, Sonora by Mexican authorities. Dan Kelly, the third member, was recognized mid-shave by an astute barber who alerted law enforcement. Tex Howard and Red Sample, the ringleader and the final member respectively, surfaced in Clifton 5 days post-robbery, flashing their ill-gotten wealth. A distinctive double-cased gold pocket watch inscribed with the name William Clancy, identified by sharp-eyed bartender Walter Bush as part of the loot extorted from Goldwater, proved their undoing. In short order, the last 2 fugitives were jailed alongside their partners in crime. The wheels of justice turned swiftly. After a speedy trial, the captured outlaws were sentenced to hang on March 28, 1884. However, the gruesome tally of the dead and condemned sparked by Johnny Tapinier's murder was not yet complete. Focus shifted to John Heath, suspected accomplice to the robbery-turned-massacre. Trial testimony brought to light Heath's backstory, a Texas native who had arrived in Bisbee mere days before the bloodbath, entering into a saloon venture with a Mr. Waite. It was revealed that Heath and Howard, both Texans, had been partners for 3 years, drifting apart before reuniting in Clifton, Arizona. During the Clifton to Bisbee journey, their party grew to 6, joined by Bill Delaney, Dan Kelly, Red Sample, and Big Ben Dowd. The original aim split the group. Ben, Red, and York planned to push on to Mexico, while Heath intended to settle in Bisbee and go straight with a legitimate enterprise. Ultimately, ringleader Howard roped them all into his illicit scheme. Heath's level of complicity being argued, the court found him guilty as an accessory, sentencing him to 20 years in Yuma Territorial Prison, likely to his relief. But the citizens of Bisbee, robbed of 4 of their own that fateful December night, would not be placated by anything less than a life for a life. In the pre-dawn hours of February 22, 1884, an armed mob 50 strong rode from Bisbee to Tombstone. After securing a length of rope from a store, grimly co-owned by Joe Goldwater of the ravaged Mercantile, the angry vigilantes completed their grisly errand. As Tombstone awoke, John Heath's lifeless body dangled from a telephone pole, swaying in the morning breeze. The coroner's inquest would inscrutably conclude that the deceased died of emphysema of the lungs, which might have been caused by strangulation, self-inflicted or otherwise. Thus, through swift judicial process and brute street justice, the 6 men behind the bungled Bisbee payroll heist paid for their crimes, their misdeeds remembered to this day by 2 weather-beaten grave markings, one for the 5 hanged by law, the other for the one lynched by the mob, standing sentinel in Tombstone's Boot Hill Cemetery. And so concludes our retelling of the dark chapter of Arizona's territorial days, known as the Bisbee Massacre. 4 townspeople killed in a robbery gone wrong, 5 criminals hanged, and 1 alleged accomplice lynched, a total of 10 lives lost in a few bloody days in 1883. A reminder of the high cost of crime and the brutal code of frontier justice in the Wild West of old. Thank you for joining me on this desert romp. The year was 1909. The setting, the rugged deserts of Southern California, a vast and unforgiving landscape of boulders, dry lake beds, and desolate mountains. It was here that a manhunt unfolded that would go down in the annals of the Old West, the pursuit of a Paiute Native American known as Willie Boy, who had murdered the father of the young woman he loved and kidnapped her, setting off a chase that would transfix the region. Our story begins with Willie Boy, a 26-year-old Paiute who worked as a cowboy in the town of Banning. By all accounts, Willie Boy was known as a dependable, hard worker. But his downfall began when he fell in love with a 14-year-old Paiute girl named Isoleta Boniface. When he made his affections known in 1908, her father, a man known as Old Mike, sternly warned Willie Boy to stay away from his young daughter. Enraged by this rejection, Willie Boy took matters into his own hands, kidnapping Isoleta from her family's camp in 29 Palms. Old Mike tracked the young couple down, retrieved his daughter, and angrily threatened to kill Willie Boy if he ever came near her again. This incident seemed to change Willie Boy, turning him surly and resentful. Things came to a head on September 26, 1909. Willie Boy had been drinking heavily with a young white friend who had just returned from a trip to see the circus in San Bernardino. Drunk and alone with his rage after his friend left, Willie Boy made his way to the Gilman Ranch where the Boniface family worked in the summers. He broke into a supply shed, stole a Winchester rifle and ammunition, and crept up to where Old Mike and his family slept under a cottonwood tree. Standing over the sleeping family, he shot Old Mike point-blank in the head, killing him instantly. As the terrified family awoke screaming, Willie Boy held them at gunpoint, threw a colorful scarf and garters at Isolata, then dragged the girl by the wrist into a nearby ravine. He spent the night there, threatening to slaughter the whole family if they made a sound. Paralyzed with fear, the family didn't report the murder until 6 the next morning. That's when the local constable and Native American agent Ben de Crèvecoeur sprang into action, quickly forming a posse that included an experienced tracker named Joe Tutane. They found Willie Boy's trail leading from the Gilman Ranch across the orchards and railroad tracks, making its way into the rugged hills and desert to the east. Tracking an experienced native across miles of rocks and heavy brush was no easy feat, but many in the posse were expert trackers in their own right, having grown up with the Native Americans and learned their ways. All that first day, they remained hot on Willie Boy's heels, even getting close enough to hear the screams of his terrified captive Isolata. But Willie Boy used all his cunning to stay out of sight, sometimes even doubling back to trail his trackers. As night fell, the posse had to stop near the Whitewater Ranch, hoping to close in on their quarry at dawn. But Willie Boy had gotten an early start under the cover of the dark, stormy night. Following his trail up into the Whitewater Canyon, the posse came across a chilling message scratched in a patch of mud along the creek bed. Written by Isolata, it read, "My heart is almost gone. I will be dead soon." Picking up the trail again, the posse followed it into ever more remote and forbidding territory, through canyons, over mountains, across barren valleys of rock and scrub under the merciless desert sun. While stopping to rest, the men discovered with alarm that Willie Boy had been watching them, concealed in the brush at the top of a rise. Soon they crossed the county line and were joined by another posse from San Bernardino under Deputy Sheriff Charlie Reach. The combined group tracked Willie Boy to a spot known as the Pipes. Here, they found signs of his desperate condition. He had broken into a miner's cabin, stolen supplies, and loaded them on the back of Isolata, who he used as a pack animal. The girl herself was clearly at the end of her strength, her tracks showing her stumbling, barely able to continue. It was here, in this lonely spot, that Willie Boy's flight took its cruelest turn. Isolata, starved and exhausted, had reached her limit. She dropped her heavy load and tried to run, but her weakened legs gave out after a few steps. As she leaned against a rocky wall, Willie Boy shot her in the back without hesitation, leaving her crumpled body behind as he fled, now unencumbered. The posse arrived to find her dead, her corpse battered and lacerated, feet bloody and raw. The sight filled them with both pity and grim resolve to bring Willie Boy to justice. Sending her body back to her people in Banning, they wired the news to Sheriff John Ralphs in San Bernardino, who began organizing another posse to try to cut off Willie Boy further out in the Mojave Desert, guessing he would try to reach Paiute lands in Nevada. After briefly losing Willie Boy's trail, Ben de Crèvecoeur and the others picked it up again near Surprise Spring through sheer luck. Evidence showed Willie Boy was now heading back towards 29 Palms, where he had a rifle and ammunition hidden. Arriving at the oasis of Mara, the posse found the village nearly deserted. Word of the killing had reached it, and sent most fleeing in fear. Willie Boy did recover his weapons, which had been hidden in a deep pond, but was forced to abandon them and slip away into the mesquite when he spotted the approaching posse. For days more the chase continued, back and forth across vast stretches of waterless desert and mountains, the posse always on the verge of catching their elusive quarry, but never quite reaching him. Even when pushed to his limits, His energy and endurance remained astounding. In one spot, they found where he had thrown himself down in a dry lake bed to suck the last traces of moisture from the mud. In another, they discovered the remains of a lizard he had roasted over a small fire, a meager meal for a desperate man. On the fifth day, the frustration and strain reached a breaking point. The posse had split up to cover more ground. Charlie Resha and several others were scouting south of Saddle Rock Spring when a shot suddenly rang out and Charlie's horse crumpled beneath him. The lawman crashed to the ground, a bullet through his hip. More shots followed as Willie Boy, concealed in the rocks above, targeted the group's horses, killing two and crippling a third. The men dove for cover, but Willie Boy had them pinned down. They couldn't reach the badly wounded Charlie without exposing themselves to the deadly fire. They remained trapped there all day, Willie Boy taunting them, yelling, "Why don't you come out in the open? I would shoot an Indian, but not a white man." At nightfall, they were finally able to reach Charlie. Sending a man for help, they began the arduous trek to get him to a doctor. Shortly after the messenger left, a single muffled shot echoed from the rocks above, a seemingly unimportant detail at the time. When Ben de Crèvecoeur and the others arrived on the scene, an argument broke out about what to do. Some wanted to press on after Willie Boy now that they had him cornered, but in the end, Sheriff Ralphs decided they needed to regroup, resupply, and fetch more men before returning to finish the job. It was a delay that would prove fateful. It took several days to get organized again, but soon a force of 100 men had been assembled, split into 3 posses to converge on Willie Boy's last known location from multiple directions. Ben's group reached the scene of the ambush first, carefully scouting the boulder-strewn hillside with weapons at the ready, still wary of Willie Boy lurking in ambush. But as Ben approached a rock outcropping, he spotted a man's knee sticking up from behind it. When it seemed to move, Ben fired, his bullet ripping through the brush. Advancing cautiously with the others, they found Willie Boy lying dead behind the rocks, a single bullet hole through his chest. In his final moments, Willie Boy had used his second-to-last cartridge to toss away his few meager possessions in a traditional Paiute death ritual. Then, removing his boot, he had used his last bullet to take his own life, pulling the trigger with his toe. The final gunshot the posse had heard that night was the sound of Willie Boy's suicide. In the end, Willie Boy had eluded capture to the very end, dying on his own terms. Over the course of an 11-day chase across some of the most rugged and inhospitable terrain imaginable, the Paiute fugitive had covered an astounding 500 to 600 miles on foot, armed and burdened, relentlessly pursued by men on horseback. While his crimes were reprehensible, his sheer tenacity and almost superhuman endurance earned him a begrudging respect. At the insistence of the Native American trackers, Willie Boy's body was burned on a pyre of juniper wood, as was Paiute custom. The posse, exhausted and reflective, returned to civilization, the deed done but hardly satisfied. Willie Boy's rifle would later go on display in Riverside, a relic of one of the most remarkable manhunts the West had ever seen. And while the Paiute desperado's story passed into legend, it was for those who had relentlessly tracked him, like Ben de Crèvecoeur, an unshakable memory of an exceptional man and one of the greatest tests of their own skill and determination in a long career on the brutal frontier. This has been the story of Willie Boy, the Paiute renegade whose flight across the Southern California desert would become enshrined in the mythology of the Old West. A tale of forbidden love, revenge, murder, and a chase that would push men to their limits in the merciless desert wilderness. While Willie Boy's motives may be questionable, his sheer prowess and determination were undeniable. His pursuers, hard frontiersmen like Ben de Crèvecoeur, represented the last days of the Old West, when Native Americans and lawmen still played a deadly game of cat and mouse across a rugged landscape that has now largely been tamed, but still remains a powerful symbol of the untamed frontier and the determined men who brought their own justice to it. Thank you for joining me on this desert romp. Welcome to another tale of the Southwest Desert. In today's episode, we'll be exploring the notorious exploits of Juan Flores, a horse thief and outlaw who terrorized Southern California in the mid-19th century. His story is one of crime, revenge, murder, and ultimately, justice at the end of a rope. So sit back and join me as we journey back to the wild days of 1857 in Old California. Our story begins on a pleasant January day in 1857. An American named Garnet Hardy was driving his four-horse wagon along the old country road between Los Angeles and San Juan Capistrano. Hardy was proud of his fine horses, with their glossy coats and powerful builds, but he was also constantly anxious, as the area was known to be infested with horse thieves. In fact, just a year prior, this very team had been stolen by a thief who ended up being caught and sentenced to 10 years in San Quentin prison. As Hardy approached the town of San Juan Capistrano, a reputed hideout for several notorious robbers, he had an uneasy feeling. After arriving in the early afternoon, he delivered his load, fed his horses, and went to explore the town. While Hardy was occupied, 4 men, one of them, an apparent stranger, sauntered over to critically examine his fine team of horses. The town streets were deserted as the residents took their afternoon siesta, but the men were observed by at least one pair of bright, curious eyes belonging to a young woman named Margarita. Margarita thought she recognized the young stranger, an attractive native Californian. Feeling a bit piqued when he passed by her open doorway without so much as a glance, she contrived an errand to the town store to get a better look. Throwing a shawl over her head, Margarita headed up the street, casting a quick glance at the men as she passed. With a second look, her suspicion was confirmed. The man was Juan Flores himself. Seeing Juan Flores greatly surprised Margarita, as he was supposedly serving a long sentence in San Quentin for horse thievery. Slowly making her way back from the store, she noticed Flores angrily gesticulating and talking in agitated tones, seemingly provoked by the sight of Hardy's horses. Margarita's curiosity was piqued. She silently slipped into an abandoned adobe building next to where the men were conversing in low, serious tones. Pressing her ear to a crack in the wall, what she overheard made her grow faint. The men were plotting to waylay and murder Hardy when he left town and make off with his horses to Sonora. Flores, it seemed, had recently escaped from prison. Recognizing the horses as the same ones he had previously stolen, he now burned for revenge against Hardy for the role he played in sending Flores to jail. As the men moved off and Hardy returned to his wagon, Margarita's first instinct was to rush out and warn the American of the deadly danger awaiting him. But not speaking English and fearing Flores might see her and kill them both, she instead raced to alert her friend Don Juan at his nearby rancho. Hearing Margarita's story, Don Juan rushed into town and discreetly informed Hardy of the plot against his life. That night, a messenger was dispatched under the cover of darkness to alert the Los Angeles sheriff about the escaped convict Flores's whereabouts and his murderous intentions. The very next day, a posse of 5 men, led by Sheriff James Barton, and including Hardy's brother Alfred, set out from Los Angeles to apprehend Flores. Barton, considered a fearless lawman, nonetheless seemed to have a premonition of his impending doom as he took the unusual step of making out his will before embarking. After camping for a night, the posse reached the Sepulveda Rancho around mid-morning, where they were treated to a generous rancho breakfast. The men had brought an assortment of shotguns and revolvers, which they removed and left on the porch while dining, retrieving them before continuing their pursuit. Their group was joined by a Frenchman also traveling south. About 12 miles further along, as Barton and a deputy rode in the lead with Alfred Hardy and the Frenchman trailing behind, a group of 16 horsemen suddenly appeared from behind a hill a few hundred yards off the road. Though not unusual to see vaqueros traveling in a group, Barton halted suspiciously and called for the others to ride up and join him. As the large group approached, Barton's posse prepared to dismount and confront them, but the horsemen claimed to be friends and, appearing unarmed, the lawmen remained mounted. Barton recognized Flores among the group, as well as another wanted bandit, Pancho Daniel. He called for them to surrender, but undaunted, the bandits continued riding straight at them. Then, when just a few yards away, the outlaws suddenly produced revolvers and opened fire on the lawmen. Barton and his deputies, though expert marksmen, were caught by surprise. Returning fire at close range, they were shocked when none of the outlaws fell, leading to suspicion the bandits had secretly removed the shot from their guns during breakfast. In the furious close-quarters gunfight that followed, Barton and 3 of his deputies were quickly shot from their saddles. The unarmed Frenchman immediately turned and fled, with Alfred Hardy following close behind after his own horse became unmanageable. Clearly outmatched, Hardy and the Frenchman spurred their mounts and raced away, Hardy's speedy horse allowing him to outpace their pursuers. Strangely, the bandits left the Frenchman unharmed. After callously stripping the dead lawmen of valuables and arms, then shooting their prone bodies full of holes, Flores and his gang rode back to San Juan Capistrano, drunkenly celebrating their victory and taking over the town. Hardy, upon returning and seeing what had happened, grabbed his wagon team and fled, taking a long roundabout route through the mountains before finally reaching Los Angeles over a week later with news of the massacre. Hardy's report of the brutal slaying of the sheriff and his men provoked a firestorm of shock and outrage in Los Angeles. When the bullet-riddled bodies were brought back the next day, it seemed the entire populace turned out for their burial, united in their desire for swift retribution against the cowardly killers. Sheriff Barton had been a very popular figure and his loss was deeply felt. Volunteer posses quickly formed, including a large contingent from the nearby town of El Monte, which was known as a bit of a rough frontier settlement. Prominent California rancher Don Pio Pico, himself a former governor, provided mounts for the men. Within 2 days, a force of 50 riders under the command of General Andres Pico set out for San Juan Capistrano. The pursuers spent several days scouring the hills around San Juan Capistrano, eventually splitting into 3 groups, one heading up the coast, one down, and a third made up of Mexicans, Californios, and the El Monte boys striking out for the mountains. It was this third group that caught a break on the 4th or 5th day as they crossed over the ridges between Aliso and Santiago Canyon. As the sun rose that fateful morning, the canyons were still covered in dense brush, largely uninhabited. Pausing on a ridge to get their bearings, the vigilantes heard the sound of voices drifting up from below. Gazing down, they spotted a group of 8 men on horseback riding slowly down the canyon. With whoops and hollers, the posse spurred their mounts and raced down the steep slope to cut off their quarry. Flores and his men responded with curses. Seeing their way blocked, they wheeled around and charged back up the narrow canyon. A few wild shots were exchanged, but amazingly, no one was hit. But the treacherous, rocky terrain of the canyon worked against the fleeing bandits. Coming to a fork, they tried to scramble up the steep middle ridge, only to find themselves trapped at the top of a cliff, with the vengeful posse right behind them and cutting off any escape back down. The jig appeared to be up for the cornered outlaws, But in a desperate ploy, the wily Flores and two of his compadres abandoned their horses and scrambled over the sheer drop-off, half climbing, half falling down the cliff face at the risk of their necks. One of their horses, attempting to follow, lost its footing and plunged to its death on the rocks below. The remaining 5 bandits, stalling just long enough for Flores to get away, had no choice but to meekly surrender to the posse. While some of the El Monte men took the captured outlaws to be held at a nearby adobe, the rest continued their dogged pursuit of Flores and the other 2 escapees. For the rest of that day and into the next, they hounded them through the rugged, brush-choked hills, not letting up for a moment. Finally, in a stroke of luck, a hungry Flores made the mistake of firing his pistol to shoot a rabbit, allowing his pursuers to zero in on the shot. He was captured and taken to join his gang at the adobe. The other 2 fugitives were also run to ground and apprehended later that same day, not far away as the posse was returning to the valley floor. But just when it seemed the saga was over, a messenger arrived with shocking news. Overnight, Flores had somehow managed to chew through his bonds and untie one of his men, who freed the rest. Overpowering their guards, the bandits had once again escaped into the night. While the others were quickly recaptured, Flores had vanished like a ghost into the darkness, presumably returning to his mountain hideouts. The posse halted to confer amongst themselves and come up with a new plan. It was decided they would have to comb the highest reaches of the mountains to flush out the slippery floors once and for all. The other prisoners would only slow them down. Besides, there was no clear proof tying them directly to the murder of the sheriff and his men. Still, they were known to be gamblers and villains who kept bad company. A short time later, the vigilantes emerged from beneath the trees to continue their pursuit. The captured bandits were no longer with them, however. They had been left to dangle lifelessly from the stout branches of the sycamores, strung up by the angry mob without judge or jury. Unaware of his gang's grim fate, Flores made his way on foot toward Los Angeles. His plan was to secretly enter the city and lay low with friends until the tumult and scrutiny around his crimes eased somewhat. However, upon reaching the outskirts, he found all entry and exit from the city was being tightly controlled and monitored. There was no way in without being spotted and nabbed. Famished and footsore from days in the wild, the fugitive reached out to associates who had helped him in the past, begging for shelter and aid. But word of his deeds had spread, and the dragnet was so tight that none dared assist him, not even with so much as a crust of bread. Demoralized and desperate, Flores slunk off to hide in the Cahuenga Hills on the city's edge. There, a few days later, his luck finally ran out as he was captured by the authorities. The swarthy young bandito's flair for hair's-breadth escapes had finally failed him. A short time later, Flores was unceremoniously hanged for his crimes on the spot where the Grand County Courthouse now stands. He went to the gallows with his head held high. Though admitting his guilt, he claimed Pancho Daniel had actually been the ringleader behind the ambush and murder of Sheriff Barton's posse. He was just 22 years old. In the months that followed, most of Flores' crew were rounded up as well and imprisoned for life or executed. Daniel proved hardest to find, staying on the run for nearly 2 years. But the law caught up to him at last, still wearing a belt taken from the dead Sheriff Barton. One morning, the townspeople awoke to find his body dangling from a beam in front of the Los Angeles jailhouse, strung up by parties unknown as a grim warning and reminder that justice, even belated justice, always prevailed. And so ends the story of Juan Flores, youthful horse thief turned cop killer and public enemy #1. His lightning escape from San Quentin and murderous vendetta against the lawman who put him away culminated in the brutal slayings that became known as the Barton Massacre, one of the deadliest attacks on peace officers in the era. Flores's subsequent flight into the mountains of Orange County, dogged by one of the largest manhunts in the region's history, has embedded many local place names such as Flores Peak on the map to this day. Well, Thank you for joining us on another Southwest adventure. Welcome to the Southwest Desert, the channel that brings you stories from the Southwest frontier days. Today we're delving into the life of one of the most notorious outlaws of the Old West, Billy the Kid. Our tale comes from the recollections of J.E. Sly, a resident of Lincoln County during the time of Billy's exploits. So saddle up and get ready for a journey into the heart of the Wild West. Billy's father was a soldier in the regular army, stationed at Fort Bayard near Silver City, New Mexico. When he passed away, he left behind a wife and 3 children, with Billy being the eldest at about 15 years old. Determined to help his mother make ends meet, Billy soon found himself drawn to the life of a cowboy on the cattle range. It was on the range that Billy began to make a name for himself. He quickly became an expert rider of broncos and showed great skill with a lariat. As Billy's reputation grew, his nickname evolved. His fellow cowboys began calling him Billy, and soon he became known far and wide as Billy the Kid. Despite his young age, Billy was no longer just a boy in the eyes of his peers. Standing only about 5 feet tall with small hands and feet, Billy didn't cut an imposing figure at first glance. He had a dark, swarthy complexion and hair as black as the ravens that roam the plains. But it was his eyes that truly set him apart. Black and piercing, they seemed to glow with an intense light, especially when Billy was excited. Those who knew him spoke of an unconquerable determination that shone in his gaze, a quality that would come to define his character. Billy's courage and cool head under pressure soon made him a natural leader among the cowboys. When a particularly dangerous or difficult job needed doing, the ranch bosses would invariably turn to Billy. They knew that no matter the odds, Billy would see the task through to completion. This fearlessness served Billy well in the frequent skirmishes with Apache raiders that plagued the ranchers of New Mexico. Time and again, Billy was chosen to lead the charge against marauding Native Americans, and he always emerged victorious. His reputation grew to such an extent that even the fierce Apache warriors came to fear the name of Billy the Kid. One particular incident serves to illustrate Billy's exceptional bravery and quick thinking. It occurred at a ranch northeast of Fort Bayard, on the edge of the plains. The ranch belonged to a man named Irvington, who lived there with his wife and 4 children, the eldest being a girl of 10. One fateful day, Irvington had gone to the mountains about 5 miles west of his home to collect timber for a corral he was building. With relations between the settlers and local Native Americans seeming peaceful, no one anticipated any trouble. However, 4 young Apache braves on a hunting expedition spotted Irvington heading into the mountains and saw an opportunity for mischief. The braves circled around behind a low ridge, out of sight of the ranch, and approached from the rear of the corral. They tied up their ponies and suddenly appeared at the open door of the ranch house, where Mrs. Irvington and all the children were gathered. At first, Mrs. Irvington wasn't alarmed, as the Native Americans wore no war paint and she assumed they were friendly. She rose to greet them, but as soon as she reached the door, the braves pushed their way inside, closing the door behind them. 2 of the braves took up positions guarding the door and window, while the other 2 seized Mrs. Irvington and her eldest daughter. A struggle ensued, with Mrs. Irvington fighting back with all her might and screaming for help. One of the Apaches struck her, knocking her unconscious. The other children, terrified, hid under the bed. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, the door burst open with a bang. In that moment, Billy the Kid leaped into the room, his guns blazing. With lightning speed and deadly accuracy, he fired 2 shots, dropping the two Native Americans in front of him. One of the remaining braves managed to slip out of the room and escape, but the last one stood his ground, determined to fight. The brave got off one shot but missed. Billy, cool as ever, returned fire and put an end to the threat. Without missing a beat, Billy checked outside for the escaped brave, only to see him fleeing across the valley on his pony. When the dust settled, Billy found the entire family safe and unharmed, save for the blow Mrs. Irvington had received. The family could scarcely believe that this young man, single-handed, had killed 3 of the attackers and driven off the 4th. As it turned out, Billy had been out on the range when he spotted the 4 braves heading towards the ranch. His keen instincts told him something was amiss, so he followed them, arriving just in time to save the Irvington family from a terrible fate. This incident showcased all of Billy's remarkable qualities: his sharp eye, his lightning-fast reflexes, his deadly accuracy with a gun, and above all, his absolute fearlessness in the face of danger. It was said that Billy could shoot a coyote or jackrabbit while riding at full gallop, a feat that speaks to his exceptional skill with firearms. The lone brave who escaped spread word of the encounter among his people, though he claimed a large group of men had ambushed them. When the truth came out, it only added to Billy's growing legend among both settlers and natives. As Billy's fame grew, the territory of New Mexico was undergoing significant changes. The vast, open ranges that had long been ignored by settlers suddenly became hotly contested. Men of means began to realize the value of controlling large tracts of land with access to water, recognizing that whoever held these resources would reap substantial profits from the excellent grama grass that grew in abundance. This rush to claim land led to fierce conflicts between rival ranchers and their supporters. These disputes were often settled not in courtrooms or land offices, but on the ground with guns and fists. It was in one such ranch contest that Billy the Kid would find himself embroiled in a conflict that would set him on the path to true outlaw status. Billy's involvement in this dispute, which ended in victory for his side, brought him to the attention of the courts and grand jury. To evade the law, Billy relocated to Lincoln County, setting the stage for what would become known as the Lincoln County War. At the outset of this conflict, Billy had powerful friends and supporters backing him. However, his wild and uncontrollable nature soon led these influential allies to distance themselves from him one by one. Left to his own devices, Billy was more than willing to go it alone, confident in his ability to outmaneuver both his enemies and the law. Billy might have continued his outlaw ways for years, eluding capture and adding to his notoriety. However, a significant change came to Lincoln County with the discovery of gold at White Oaks. This strike brought a flood of newcomers to the area, many of them law-abiding citizens from the east looking to make their fortunes. White Oaks quickly grew into a bustling frontier town, strategically located about 80 miles east of Socorro on the Rio Grande, and a similar distance from Roswell on the Pecos River. It sat roughly halfway between El Paso to the south and Las Vegas to the north, each about 160 miles distant. The influx of respectable businessmen and miners began to shift the balance of power in Lincoln County. These newcomers, seeking stability and prosperity, soon created a strong sentiment in favor of law and order. They saw the ongoing war in the county as a major obstacle to growth and development. Despite the changing atmosphere, Billy and his gang would still visit White Oaks from time to time. They generally kept a low profile and behaved themselves during these visits. Had they continued this cautious approach, it's possible that Billy might have eventually received a pardon, bringing an end to the ongoing conflict. However, Billy had made some bitter enemies among the old-timers who had settled in White Oaks. These men, who had been fighting against Billy for years, feared his presence in town and didn't want to see him become a respectable citizen. When Judge Ira E. Leonard, a former federal district judge from Missouri, began working to secure a pardon for Billy from Governor Lew Wallace, these old enemies rallied opposition to the idea. They played on the fears of the newcomers, convincing many that pardoning Billy would only prolong the conflict rather than end it. This turn of events infuriated Billy, particularly against a man named Bill Hudgens, who ran a saloon and gambling hall in White Oaks and was a leading voice against the pardon. Billy vowed to settle the score with Hudgens, a threat that Hudgens took very seriously. Hudgens managed to turn one of Billy's own gang against him, using whiskey to loosen the man's tongue and gain information about Billy's movements and intentions. This betrayal allowed Hudgens and his allies to keep close tabs on Billy, further intensifying the animosity between the two men. The situation came to a head one evening when Billy and some of his friends arrived in White Oaks after dark. Word quickly spread that the infamous Outlaw was in town, causing widespread excitement and tension. Realizing they had been spotted, Billy and his gang quickly left town, heading north to Lobo Spring, about 4 miles away. The next morning, when one of Billy's men returned to town for supplies, their location was compromised. A posse was hastily formed to capture the outlaws, with John Hudgens, Bill's brother, leading the charge. As the posse approached the spring, Billy's lookout spotted them and the gang fled down the canyon. In the ensuing chase, a single shot rang out from Billy's group, striking John Hudgens's horse in the head and killing it instantly. Had the horse not raised its head at that precise moment, John Hudgens himself would have been killed. This close call sent a chill through the posse, and they retreated to White Oaks. Billy and his companions continued north, eventually stopping at a friend's newly established roadhouse near a waterhole. However, their respite was short-lived. Some passing freighters recognized Billy and brought word back to White Oaks. By 9 o'clock that evening, a new posse had been organized, this time led by Bill Hudgens himself. As dawn broke the next morning, the posse had surrounded the small shack where Billy and his gang were sleeping. The owner of the shack, emerging to do his morning chores, was promptly arrested. Someone in the posse must have given away their position, because suddenly a rifle shot from inside the cabin tore through a hat being worn by one of the posse members, barely missing his head. This touched off a prolonged gun battle, with both sides exchanging fire for several hours. Finally, Billy's group raised a white flag, calling for a parley. They requested that Jim Sanders, a member of the posse, come to the cabin to discuss terms of surrender. Despite some reservations, Sanders was allowed to approach the cabin. However, once inside, Billy refused to let him leave, using him as a human shield to prevent the posse from firing into the building. This standoff continued for about 2 hours, with the posse growing increasingly anxious about Sanders' fate. Suddenly, Sanders came flying out of the cabin window, but before he could reach safety, a shot rang out from inside, killing him almost instantly. It was later learned that Billy himself had fired the fatal shot. This shocking turn of events demoralized the posse, who retreated to White Oaks with Sanders' body. While Billy had once again emerged victorious, this incident proved to be a turning point in public opinion. The cold-blooded killing of Sanders galvanized the community against Billy and his gang. The people of Lincoln County were now determined to elect a sheriff who would make it his mission to rid the area of outlaws once and for all. The man chosen for this task was Pat Garrett, who won the election for sheriff by an almost unanimous vote. Garrett's relentless pursuit of Billy the Kid, including the outlaw's capture, daring escape, and eventual demise, would go on to become the stuff of legend. This has been the Southwest Desert. Join us next time for more tales from the Southwest. Until then, may your aim be true and your powder dry. Welcome to today's episode, where we'll explore the story of Polk and Posey, leaders of the last serious Native American uprising in the United States. This tale takes us to the early 20th century in southeastern Utah, where a band of renegade Utes defied the federal government for years. Our story begins in May 1914, when the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in Washington received an alarming telegram. Claude C. Covey, superintendent of the Navajo Springs Indian Agency in southwestern Colorado, reported the discovery of a Mexican man's body on the reservation. Evidence pointed to murder, with a Ute Native American as the prime suspect. This incident marked the beginning of a 7-year period filled with outrages, battles, arrests, and escapes. The situation would escalate to the point where U.S. cavalry intervention was considered, ending only with the death of one of the main leaders. To understand the context, let's look at the history of the Ute people. When Spanish explorer Escalante discovered them around the time of the American Revolution, they were warrior people, wild and roving. Their primary enemies were the Navajo to the south. They lived by hunting and gathering. As white settlers pushed into their territory, their tribe and their cousins, the Paiutes, were forced into inhospitable canyon lands. This harsh environment couldn't support their traditional lifestyle, and they became impoverished, living in brush and mud huts, subsisting on grasshoppers, vegetation, and sometimes reptiles. The arrival of white settlers brought horses and livestock to the region. The Ute tribe, Paiutes, and Navajo began acquiring stock. While the Navajo became relatively wealthy with large flocks, the Ute tribe and Paiutes remained more primitive and untamed. Although reservations were established, many Ute tribesmen preferred to roam the isolated plateaus and canyons, far from government supervision. These roving bands became a nuisance to white stockmen and farmers. Fear of a Native American uprising led whites to treat them cautiously, which some Native Americans interpreted as weakness. The boldest became renegades, stealing stock and living outside the law. From their perspective, they had never made a treaty with the whites and considered themselves a sovereign nation. They were simply living where their ancestors had always lived, adhering to the harsh law of survival their environment had taught them. Among these renegade bands, 3 leaders emerged: Mancos Jim, Old Polk, and Posey. Their actions would build enmity with their neighbors that would eventually lead to their downfall. Returning to 1914 after receiving Covey's telegram, the Indian Affairs Office gathered sworn testimonies. One Native American, Cavie's son, testified that he had encountered Polk's son on the road. Polk's son, also known as Tsay-Nagat or Everett Hatch, had asked about a Mexican man and declared his intention to kill him for his money. Even more damning was the testimony of young cattle herders. They reported hearing gunshots and seeing a man, identified as Tsay-Nagat, apparently disposing of a body. When they investigated, they found the dead Mexican. The witnesses admitted they hadn't reported the incident immediately, fearing Tsay-Nagat and his father, Old Polk, known as dangerous men. With this evidence, it seemed to be an open and shut case. The challenge was arresting Tsay-Nagat, who had fled to the hills with his father. Agent Covey first tried to persuade them to surrender peacefully, but they turned back before reaching the reservation. Covey then requested a U.S. Marshal serve a warrant on the Ute. However, when a deputy marshal encountered the group, he didn't attempt to serve the warrant, fearing violence. Meanwhile, Old Polk and his band wandered the countryside, confident their threats would deter any arrest attempts. Lorenzo D. Creel, a special agent working with scattered Native American bands in Utah, visited Tsay-Nagat and was impressed with the young man. He considered Tsay-Nagat mild-mannered, but viewed Old Polk as an all-round bad Indian. Creel estimated Polk's followers numbered about 25 Ute and Paiute tribesmen. For months, tension simmered, but it seemed major conflict might be avoided. However, in February 1915, the situation escalated dramatically. Indian Commissioner Cato Sells ordered Creel to assist U.S. Marshal Nebeker in arresting the wanted men, who now included Old Posey along with Polk and St. Agat. On February 21, 1915, the first clash occurred. Marshal Nebeker had organized a posse of 20 men and located the renegades hidden in Combe Wash. The posse surrounded the camp before sunrise, but the Native Americans opened fire, killing one posse member. The posse returned fire, killing one Native American. The battle lasted 2 hours. During the night, the posse scattered the warriors and captured some. However, the leaders, Polk, St. Agat, and Posey, escaped. It's believed they may have used Old Posey's secret getaway route, a hidden trail leading up an apparently unscalable 2,000-foot sandstone escarpment. Posey's knowledge of the terrain and seemingly miraculous escapes had made him both feared and admired. The situation remained tense in the following days. Citizens demanded immediate government action. Peaceful Native Americans were terrified, fearing they would be the first targets if Polk and Posey's band attacked. The outlaws themselves were in dire straits, their horses dead or dying, facing harsh winter conditions with little food, inadequate clothing, and minimal shelter. The weather hampered both sides. Roads were impassable except on horseback, and communication was difficult due to cut or downed telephone lines. The whites had to navigate unfamiliar terrain cautiously, while the Native Americans knew the land intimately. By late February, the combined bands of Polk and Posey had grown to over 100 people, though this number was constantly reduced by surrenders and the toll of exposure. The fugitives had crossed the San Juan River and entrenched themselves north of the Navajo reservation, preparing for a final stand. As tensions rose, there were calls for military intervention. Instead of sending cavalry, the government dispatched Brigadier General Hugh L. Scott to take charge and find a solution. The first breakthrough came on March 11th, when Mrs. Wetherill, wife of a famous Navajo trader, inquired about possible terms for Polk and his son's surrender. Largely due to her efforts, on March 20th, St. Agat, Polk, Posey, and Posey's son surrendered to General Scott at Mexican Hat. All except St. Agat were taken to Salt Lake City, tried, acquitted, and returned to the Navajo Springs Reservation, under conditions of good conduct and a promise to remain there. St. Agat was taken to Denver to be tried for the murder of Juan Chacon, the Mexican man. Interestingly, despite the evidence against him, St. Agat convinced General Scott, Agent Creel, and Superintendent Jenkins of his innocence. Public sentiment grew in his favor, particularly after he was moved from jail to a hospital for tuberculosis treatment. With excellent legal aid, St. Agat was acquitted on July 15, 1915, and returned to the reservation. However, the story was far from over. Old Polk, Posey, and their bands had promised to settle on the reservation, but they only stayed briefly before resuming their nomadic lifestyle. The next few years saw ongoing conflicts between the renegade bands and white settlers. Some actions were marked by extreme cruelty, with cattle found mutilated or beaten to death. Posey seemed to have replaced Polk as the leader of these outrages. Now, around 50 years old, Posey was at the height of his notoriety. His repeated escapes from danger had led him to boast, "Me all same Jes Christ, white man's bullets no can hit." The situation simmered until early 1923, when two young Native Americans from Posey's band, Joe Bishop's boy and Shanup's boy, raided a sheep camp. When a warrant was issued for their arrest, Posey refused to give them up. After negotiations, it was arranged for the boys to surrender in Blanding. They were tried and found guilty in the local justice court, with the intention of passing a light sentence of about 10 days in jail. However, Utah law required a 6-hour gap between conviction and sentencing. During this time, as the sheriff was taking the boys into custody, they attempted to escape. Joe Bishop's boy managed to grab the sheriff's gun, but it failed to fire when he pulled the trigger. In the ensuing chaos, both young men escaped into a crowd of Native Americans and fled town on waiting ponies. A car chase and then a horseback pursuit ensued, with gunfire exchanged between the posse and the fleeing Native Americans. They retreated to a high, narrow plateau southwest of Blanding, a place difficult to access and seemingly easily defensible. A siege began, with gunfire exchanged throughout the afternoon. Joe Bishop's boy was killed in the fighting, shot between the eyes as he was taking aim at a deputy. The plateau was surrounded by nightfall, and the posse worked its way to the top during the night. The siege continued through the second day, with little firing. By the second night, overwhelmed by the posse's numbers, the Native Americans agreed to surrender. However, when account was taken of the prisoners, one notable figure was missing. Old Posey had somehow escaped again, slipping through the besiegers' lines during the second night. It was later discovered that he had been badly wounded in the escape. More than a month passed with no word of the old renegade. Then a cryptic telegram arrived in Washington. Today's secured body of William Posey. Found him dead in mountains near where posse engaged Indians. Old Posey had indeed met his end, but it took more than a bullet to stop him. When his body was exhumed for verification, it was discovered that he had been shot low in the back and had died from gangrene. The last of the Warpath Indians in the United States had fallen. But even in death, Posey remained a figure of mystery and legend. His band later reburied his body far up Mule Creek Canyon, in a location known only to his closest and most loyal followers. In the end, the saga of Polk and Posey represents the closing chapter of armed indigenous resistance in the United States. It marked the transition to a new era in Native American history, one characterized by different forms of advocacy and cultural preservation. Today, the landscapes where these events took place remain much as they were a century ago, rugged, beautiful, and full of hidden canyons and towering mesas. For those who know the story, these lands carry the echoes of that final conflict, a testament to a turbulent past and the enduring spirit of those who called this harsh country home. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a fascinating and often overlooked chapter of American history. May it inspire us to look more deeply into the stories that shape our world and to seek greater understanding of the diverse experiences that make up our shared human story. I hope you enjoyed these Southwest Outlaw stories. Please leave a like or comment. For further desert romps, hit the subscribe button. Happy trails!